Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to be working on player animations. And this is going to be the end product. We're going to have a player that can move around and have an animation for movement, for idling, and two separate animations for jumping, one for going up and one for falling. So let's jump right in. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to work on the player animations. We're going to open up our player scene. We're going to go down to Animation Player. And you should have this window open up when you click on Animation Player under the tab Animation. Then we'll click on the animation button and we'll create a new animation. We're going to start with the idle animation. And I'm actually going to make it, this is the length of the animation right here. And so it's like 1 second long under normal play speed. But I'm actually going to make it 2 seconds long. There we go. Just to make it a little bit easier to see, and so that it plays a little bit slower than the other animations here. I'm also going to change the snap. What this does is it decides what the cursor is going to snap to. And I'm actually going to change it to 0.25. So now it will snap to the 0.25 spots. There we go. And the next thing you want to do is actually create a track here. Now you can use the Add Track button, but sometimes I find it easier to go up here and actually change the property that I want to be the track. So in this case, we're going to change the sprite 2D. Now, if we remind ourselves, we're using a sprite sheet here, meaning that we're going to be changing sprites based on the location of the sprites sheet. If you were using like actual sprites that were a single sprite, you would actually be changing the texture on these different keyframes of animation. So you would have maybe the 0 keyframe would start off with one texture, and then when you move on to the next keyframe, you would just change the texture here. We're not going to do that in our case. We're just going to be changing the coordinates of the sprite sheet, which we do down here in the rect property. The X and Y are we're going to be manipulating. Now, because the sprite sheet I've made is divided into rows, this top row right here is the idle animation, then the movement animation, then the jumping, and then the falling. So we're not going to change the Y for this animation, we're just going to change the X. And if we put this X value to 16, you can see that our sprite changes. And it's literally just moving the sprite sheet over. If you move this value around, you can actually see all it's doing is scrolling the sprite sheet. But because we know that each sprite is 16 by 16, we know that we would need to move in intervals of 16. So I'm actually going to start at 0, because that's where the first frame is. And I'm going to hit this little key button here, which will be there as long as you've already selected the animation player and had the animation window open. So I'm going to hit the key button. It's going to ask me if I want to make a reset track. That's fine. And hit create. And that first keyframe, if we click on it, let me move this so you can see it. There's the first keyframe. If we click on it, it'll actually tell us what the properties of it are. In this case, we wanted the rect value, and here it is. So you could go in and change something here if you wanted to tweak something. We don't need to tweak anything, so we're going to leave it as is. And we're going to hit Sprite 2D again. Now let me show you what sometimes happens to me is you'll click on something else, or maybe you'll close this window out, you'll go somewhere else, maybe back into the output, and then you go into your Sprite 2D and your keys are gone, and you're trying to animate and you can't. Well, you just want to click back on your animation player and it takes you back to the animation window, and then click on Sprite 2D, and now the keys are back. So we've already moved this over to the next one, which is 0.25. So now in 0.25, we want to change this rect to be 16. So I'm going to hit 16 there, and now I'm going to hit the key. And now we've got a new keyframe there, so it's going to go from one to the other like that, okay? I'm going to go to 0.5, and we'll type in 32. And we're going to hit the key button. And now we're going from 16 to 32. You can see where this is going. Now, if you're like me, maybe you're not great at doing the math on the spot in your head. And so one thing you can do is you can actually use formulas. So let's say you're at 32 and you want to add 16 to it, you can actually say plus 16 and then hit enter. And now you're at 48. And we'll hit key, and you can do plus 16 again, 64, and that puts us at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 frames This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But the 7th frame is the same as the starting frame. So we're almost done. To go a few more here. Another key there. And another key there. And I think that might be it. Yeah, if you go over 16, you're going outside of the sprite sheet, so then it's blank. So actually that's it. So I won't make an extra keyframe there. What we'll do is we'll just copy this keyframe over to the end here. And what you do is you just click on the keyframe you want to copy, and then you move the cursor to where you want to copy it, and you can right click anywhere, and you can click duplicate keys, and there you go. And we may need to tweak this a little bit, but let's see how it runs. Now that we've got the animation sorted out, we want to hit the play button right here, and we'll be able to play it. I'm just looking to make the collision shape invisible right now, so that we can better see the animation. Here we go, we're gonna hit play, and it's not exactly the result we want. There's a bunch of issues here. The first thing we want to do is we do want this animation to loop, so we're going to do animation looping here, and it's literally just moving through the frames because it's interpolating between the values, which is a lot of times what you want with animation, especially if you're using something like 3D animation, but in our case we don't want that. So one of the ways we can change that is you can go into interpolation mode right here, the little yellow triangle, and go to nearest. And now if we hit play, there you go. And it's looping. Great. That's playing pretty much how I would want. We may need to tweak the speed a little bit, but that's for later. We'll just hit pause there. And that's working out well. Now the other thing we can do here is we can actually hit this button right here, and this will say autoplay on load. Because right now, this animation won't play if we load up the game. Let me show you. We run the game, nothing's happening. But if we hit autoplay on load, that chooses which animation will start playing as soon as this scene is loaded into the game. So now if we hit play, let me save the scene first. And if we hit play, now it's playing the idle animation. And that's something that will actually change once we get into animation trees and we have the states of the animation trees deciding what to play on load and what to play based on the player states, but that's way down the line. For right now, this will work just fine for us. So the next thing we want to do is create the other animations. We'll go through this part a little bit quicker. We're going to make a movement animation. So I'm going to hit the animation box here and new. I'm going to call this move. Oops. Depending on what sprites you're using, you may want a different animation for like run versus walk, but we're just going to have one. Got a new track here. Can hit sprite 2D. And the main difference that I want to focus on here is that actually we are going to be changing the Y axis on this. Because as we said, the movement animation is the second row. So we're going to go down to 16. And our first frame is actually going to be 0, 16, referring to this sprite right here. Hit the key button, reset track is fine. And I'm going to change this back to 0.25 for the same snapping, but I'm going to leave the animation length at 1 since we have less frames to work with. So at 0.25, we'll go change the X and change it again. And one more time. And this final frame is going to be the same one as the starting frame. So I'm just going to click that and duplicate. And we want this to loop as well. So we're going to hit animation looping. And can't forget the interpolate. We're going to go nearest and try it out. And that's working. And as I mentioned earlier, the animation player does feel a little bit slow, so we'll probably tweak that in a bit. But for now, let's keep making the animations. So I'm going to make another animation. This will be jump. And click on sprite 2D. And This is going to be starting on 32Y. And we're going to hit the keyframe. And that's it for this one. It's just a single sprite. You know, I don't think we have to hit looping on this since it's a single sprite. We're going to see what happens. And one more. Fall. And we're going to go down another Y row. There we go. And that should be the 4 animations that we need. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to hit animation player over here, and we're going to change this to be 1.5. I think that'll be a little faster, and we can go into the idle animation and check it by pressing play. That looks better to me. Let's try the movement animation. Yeah, that looks a little bit better. You can actually also make it slower, and you can make it much faster than this, but I think 1.5 is going to be good. You can actually control that via code too if you need to change the speed scale for one animation versus a different animation, which is pretty neat, but we won't get into that just yet. We're also going to go up here into Agent Animator. I'm actually going to rename this to Player Animator. Player Animator, there we go. And I'm going to create a script for it. So we're going to go into the Add Script button. And I'm going to stick with the convention of lowercase with underscore. Player Animator for scripts. We don't want it in the scenes folder. So we're going to change that by clicking here. Click on scripts and Player Animator. Scripts, Player Animator, there we go. We don't need a template for this. So I'm going to uncheck that box. And it will be a no 2D. Yeah, that's fine. Create. And what I'm going to do with this script is I just want it to have a different script that controls what place the player animations right now. You could put it in your player controller, but just to try to keep it a little bit cleaner and have to refactor hopefully less later, we're going to do it this way. So going into the player animator script right here, and I want a couple of export variables. I'm going to type those out. So actually, I forgot that going back to the player controller, we never actually called this a player controller. So the way it works in Godot is you want to give certain scripts a class name. So if you type in class underscore name, and then you give it whatever name you want, you're basically naming this script. And it doesn't have to be the same name as the script name, but I try to make it the same just to be consistent, but I go for the uppercase with no underscores convention there. And then if we go back to the player animator, what you want to do is if you're typing in the variable that you want, the colons make it so that you're trying to assign a particular type to that variable. And if I hit player controller now, it'll come up on here. And it's actually, it knows now that in this export variable, it's looking for a player controller. Okay, so those are our export variables. We've got the player controller, the animation player, and the sprite 2D. We're going to be using these in order to animate and do everything having to do with animation on the player in a separate script. So next we need the process function. So function underscore process. And we're going to have a few if statements here. The first thing we're going to check is the direction of the player controller. So we're looking into the player controller variable dot direction. And we want to see the direction. In this case, it'll be either 1 or -1, since it's either going right or left. And this, if you think back to the previous video, is why we made the direction a variable up here instead of one inside of a method or function, so that we could access it from different classes or scripts. So if the player controller direction is equal to 1, then we want to access the sprite variable. and we want to flip the horizontal value of the sprite variable. Well, technically we don't want to flip it. We want to make that be false. If we click on the sprite variable here, and actually let me pull up the 2D view so you can see it. So the sprite 2D has a flip variable under the offset category here. I'm going to actually just close that out to make it easier to see. So here in offset, there is a flip H. This is the variable we're changing right now. If we press it on, you can see that it just changes the direction that the sprite is facing. It just mirrors it across the y-axis there. And we're going to be doing that on and off in order to change the direction of the character. So going back into the scripts, so if the player is moving to the right, it's going to be false because we don't want to flip it. If your sprite by default was facing left, then this logic would be inverted for you. So you have to kind of see what sprite you're using. Back to the script. So it's false if the player is moving to the right. In other words, if the direction is positive. Else if player controller direction is equal to -1, sprite dot flip H equal to true. So that will change it to flip based on the input direction from the player. We're going to save this, and before we try it out, we actually need to go into the player animator, and we need to assign these exported variables. So the player controller is right there. Now, because we did a typing there, and because the player controller has a class name, it identifies that this is a player controller. It's the only one in the scene, so there's only one choice. Animation player, there we go. And the sprite, there we go. So this should be working. Save the scene, hit play, and we've got the idle animation playing. And if I move to the right, it stays like that. If I move to the left, the player flips. And there we go. So that's the first step. Okay, the next step back in the player animator script is another if statement. I'm just going to leave a line in between to keep it a little bit more organized. And this one is going to be about movement. So we're going to check if the absolute value of the player controller dot velocity dot x is greater than 0, then we're going to do something. Now, let me explain this line. So the player controller doesn't have a velocity variable, but because it inherits from character body 2D, which does have a velocity variable, we can access it directly. If we click on these, you can actually read through the documentation here in the inspector, and you can see down here somewhere, we should have velocity right here. It's a property, and it's a vector 2. So if you go to velocity, it tells you a little bit more about how to use it. It's used and modified during calls to move and slide, which we are using move and slide down here. So because it's a vector 2, that's why we're accessing the x value of the vector 2, not the y value. That one will come a little bit later. And it's available because player controller inherits from character body 2D. Now, we're only interested in the absolute value of this. It doesn't matter if the velocity is positive or negative. We just want to know if the velocity is above 0, because that means that the player is moving. It doesn't matter if the player is moving to the right or to the left, because that's being handled up here to flip the sprite. So what do we want to do if the player velocity is above 0 in the x value? Well, we want to play the move animation. So we're going to call the animation player dot play. Whoops. The animations are accessed via a string reference, and we're going to call move. That's the name of the animation. Now this has to match the animation name on the animation player here. It has to be exactly the same. If you use underscores or spaces or capital letters, it has to be exactly the same as this, okay? You can actually go into here if you click the animation button, manage animations, and you can go into here and actually rename them and stuff. So if you need to rename them because you've gotten to this point and you're thinking, oh no, I don't want to have to access that name I made. It's going to be complicated. You can go in here and rename it. But we don't need to do that. We're just going to hit the move or play the move animation. Now, if the absolute value of the velocity in the X direction is not above 0, meaning it is 0, we are going to call the animation player again, and we're going to play the idle animation. There we go. And we're going to hit save, and now we're going to try this out. So we're going to hit play up here. I think that should be working. So idle animation, movement animation, movement to the left, movement to the right, all of that is working fine. And the sprite is flipping as expected. Very good. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is another if statement. Again, I'm putting a line in here just to keep things a little organized. You don't have to leave extra lines. But for example, one of the things you can do is you can put in comments. So if you do a hashtag here, you can say flips the character sprite. And then another comment right here. Plays the movement animation. And another comment here. Whoops. And this will be plays the jump animation. And those comments do nothing to your code. They're just there for you to organize your code better and be able to read what things do. And if you're working with other people, that can be helpful too. So I'll go ahead and leave these on in case they're helpful to anybody. But of course you can change them to be whatever you want them to be, or as descriptive as you want them to be. Okay, so in the next if statement, we're going to be looking at the player controller again. And we're going to look at the velocity again. We're going to look at the Y value. In other words, the up and down value. And if the Y value is less than 0, we're going to do something. Now, the reason we're not using absolute value here is because we want to have a different condition when the Y value is positive and when the Y value is negative, unlike in the move condition. So what we're going to do is if the Y value is negative, that means that the player is moving up. Now, if you're not super familiar with Godot, the Y values get more negative as you go up and more positive as you go down. I found this pretty unintuitive at first, so it's something to get used to if you're coming from like Unity. But one thing that actually I've noticed is maybe where it comes from is if you look at a sprite sheet, the Y values get positive as you go down, and the X values get positive as you go to the right. So this almost works like a sprite sheet in 2D where negative Y is up, positive Y is down. So going back into the scripts here, under the player animator, if the Y value is negative, that means that the player is moving up. So what we want is we want the animation player to play the jump animation. Next, we will do else if the player controller dot velocity dot Y value is greater than 0. If the velocity is positive in the Y value, then that means that the player has already hit the peak of the jump and is now falling down. And we're going to do that since we have an animation for falling. Now, depending on the jump animation that you're using for your sprites, you may not want to make a distinction between jumping and falling. That really just depends on the animations that you're using. In this case, we're going to do it. We're going to save and play. And now we can move around just like before. If I jump, you can see the jump animation is working. He has a different animation when he's moving up than when he's moving down. And that's exactly what we want. And now he can jump down here indefinitely and it'll just play the fall animation. So it looks like we don't need the looping on those. Now, if you were using a different kind of animation, you might, but for this particular instance, I think that is pretty much our player animator script. And lastly, I'm just going to go ahead and turn the collision shape back on, the visuals of it. That doesn't actually turn the collision shape itself off. And we're just going to hit play and try it out. And our Animator seems to be working great. So I think that's going to be where we stop this tutorial. And then next time, maybe we'll be working on making the level a little bit bigger so that we can actually test out more things as we're working on this platformer. So thank you so much for watching and following along the tutorial series. I hope this is helpful and I hope that you're enjoying it. Again, all of the code and all of the art is up on GitHub. The link is down in the description. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and subscribe if you want to keep up with the series. Also, if you want to help support the channel, there are links to Patreon and my coffee in the description. And a special thanks to all of the Patreons who do support this channel. It really means a lot to me. Also, on Patreon, you get access to these videos a couple days early. And that about wraps it up. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.